Well, thank y'all so much for coming. And let's give another round of applause for Tom. Wonderful work again. I know he's got to run today, but he does a great job and charges us nothing for this and does it all the time. So he'll be back tomorrow for the film screening. 1:30 tomorrow, and the film starts at 2:30 on elections and voting. So hopefully we'll see you back here again, same place. Want to say thanks also to FOW, Friends of the Waccamaw Library. So if you're not a member, I think we've had some sign-ups already today, but please see Becky and Dee back there at the table, and they will be happy to sign you right up. So we love FOW, and FOW loves us. And they make it possible to have these wonderful programs here. Pretty much all we do, adult programs, children's programs, teen programs, the upgrades to the buildings, they come from our friends of the Waccamaw Library. So please join and help them help us. So thank you to FOW. They helped make this program possible. And we also want to say thanks to Dwight Mockenville, who is the Georgetown County Library Director, and Trudy Bazemore, and Trudy's way back in the back there. Thank you, Trudy. They helped make this program possible as well and support us in all things. And thanks to Aaron Brickle, who's on the camera again today, our wonderful county videographer. This is sort of like an Oscars acceptance speech, though I've done nothing myself. But I did at least have the good sense to bring in our wonderful presenter today, the author Wiley Cash. So without further ado, we'll get to the good stuff, the reason all y'all are here, including I see Mrs. Lawson's class from Waccamaw High School, so welcome, folks. Great that y'all could join us today and meet a New York Times best-selling author, Wiley Cash, and he's done so much and he's still so young, so it's amazing. A Land More Kind Than Home in 2012, This Dark Road to Mercy, 2014, The Last Ballad, 2017, and the newly published When Ghosts Come Home, just out last month, October 2021, all from William Morrow or HarperCollins. Among other honors, and there are many other honors, so we'll have to kind of keep this brief, Wiley has won the Southern Book Award twice already, in 2013 and 2018, as well as the American Library Association Book of the Year, the Appalachian Writers Association Book of the Year, the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award, and the Pat Conroy Legacy Award. Yeah, it's okay, you can applaud. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that means a lot to us down here in the low country of South Carolina, especially. And Wiley has been a finalist for the Penn Bingham Prize and the Edgar Award for Best Novel, detective novel or mystery novel. He has published stories and essays in venues including Garden and Gun and the Oxford American. And he's Dr. Cash, we should add. He's got a PhD, so he's got some uppity documentation for his smarts as well. And he got that at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, and that's where he studied with Earnest Gains, the wonderful African-American Southern writer, and was a great mentor to Wiley Cash. Wiley is currently the alumni author in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, so up in the mountains there. And he splits time there between the mountains and the sea, Wilmington, North Carolina, where he lives with his wife, the photographer Mallory Cash, and their 2 daughters. Wiley was born and raised in the Old North State, above us there. We call it the Lesser Carolina, but we're a little prejudiced. I think they reversed that. And all his books are set there so far, in the mountains or by the sea. And I consider him one of the major writers of the new Southern Gothic. And Wiley Cash is here to read and talk about his new book, When Ghosts Come Home. Incidentally, books will be available for sale and signing right there in the back. We have a wonderful crew from Litchfield Books with us today, right there at the back table. And so afterwards, pick up a copy of this, an excellent new book, When Ghosts Come Home. It's getting wonderful press, and it's terrific. So pick that up. And Litchfield Books is also going to give an extra treat. 20% of the sales will come back to the library. So very generous. And finally, an added note, if you haven't had enough cash today, you want more cash, some more Wiley, Litchfield Books will have an additional book signing at 1 p.m. So if you want to go by and say an extra hello and pick up an extra copy for family and friends, they'll have a signing at Litchfield Books down the road at 1 p.m. today. So without further ado, I'll shut up now and we'll get to the main business today. Please welcome Wiley Cash. And,
I think I'm on. Can you all hear me? Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to take this off while I talk. I feel like I'm far enough away from these rough-looking people right here. When he was announcing my biography and he said, he's also Dr. Cash, I sensed a bit of excitement in the audience. And then when he said he's got a PhD, I felt it go down a little bit. I'll be honest with you. You're like, oh, a doctor? Oh, that kind of doctor. Okay. My mom had the same reaction when I told her. I said, Mom, I'm going to be a doctor. And she said, great. And I said, not that kind of doctor. And she said, okay, all right. And I said, well, I'll have all the rights and privileges of a doctor except the ability to write prescriptions and make money. And I also told her, I said, the kind of doctor I'm going to become, I can't keep you out of the nursing home or the hospital, but if you go there, I can read to you. I'll know which books to bring with me. And so she's happy with that so far. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the great introduction, and thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you for the great attendance. You do events on a book tour, and you're like, I don't know if anybody's going to come, and then you come to an event and people are here, and you're like, oh my gosh, now I'm nervous. We'll have to see how this goes. It's nice to have some young folks in the back of the room, bringing down the average age of the group a little bit. Let's be honest, y'all are happy to see that. You're like, great. It's also great to see some guys in the audience. Thank you, guys. You might not want to be here, but I appreciate it. I appreciate you supporting your wives. Wives, I appreciate you making them come. You heard New York Times bestseller, and you're like, it's probably going to be John Grisham. I can't believe they got him. And then you got here, and you were like, who's Wiley Cash? He's not even a real doctor. I should have stayed home. But I want to thank the friends, and I want to thank the library. This is a beautiful library. I got here a little bit early, and I was able to kind of walk around and see all the things that y'all have going on here. And this is a wonderful place, and I hope you're very proud of it. And you had music at the beginning. This is way too classy. You had a pianist. I mean, I'm used to people sleeping on the chairs before they kick the chairs and ask them to leave before the event starts. So I thought today I would talk a little bit about my new novel, When Ghosts Come Home. It came out September 21st. And the idea for the book, writing the book, and maybe read the first 50 or 75 pages of it to give you an idea of what it sounds like. I'll step away, have some warm tea. We'll cue the audiobook to pick up where I left off. I'll come back. We'll break for lunch, come back. And then take some questions about writing or publishing or agents or writing programs or anything that y'all might have about any of the other books I've written, including my first novel, The Notebook, which I wrote under the pseudonym Nicholas Sparks. It allowed me to go on to publish a much less successful string of literary novels that are really bringing down my sales figures. I told that joke in Greensboro. Speaking of the Lesser Carolinas, I was in Greensboro, North Carolina at the Rotary Club. What do you think, Rotary Club? That's going to be a sharp audience. And I told that joke, and during the signing line, this man came up and he said, "I can't believe you wrote The Notebook. I love that book." And I thought he was joking, and I said, "I think it's my best book." And then I realized he wasn't joking, and I had to tell him that I didn't write it, and he seemed pretty upset by that. But it reminds me, I was at an event one time in Asheville, and I was with several other authors, and a woman came up to me, and my name is Wiley Cash, so I can see this mistake, not given our age or height difference from what I'm about to tell you. This woman came up and she said, "I loved Serena. I loved that novel. I loved Serena so much." And all my friends that I was with looked at me, because I didn't write Serena. Ron Rash wrote Serena, who's like 6 inches taller than me and maybe 25 years older than me. And they thought, what is he going to say? And I said, you know what? I think Serena is the best book I'm ever going to write. So I'm willing to take credit for any books y'all liked today. I will sign them as well. I'll do my best to get the spellings correct. So my new novel is called When Ghosts Come Home, and this book is a little bit different than some of the others that I've written for several reasons. First, it's my first purple book. That was exciting. This is actually Oak Island, North Carolina on the cover of the book, and that's kind of exciting when you have the real place on the jacket of your book. HarperCollins put together a little book trailer for me. And it's beautiful. It's got great music, and it's got a bunch of blurbs, and the airplane from the book jacket like flies through the screen like a Ken Burns documentary. But they showed like these rivers. It definitely wasn't like a coastal scene. It looked like Wheeling, West Virginia. There were like suspension bridges and some mountains in the background. And I thought, I'm not going to show this to anybody. This isn't the coast of North Carolina. They're going to run me out of town if I show that. But this book's a little bit different for several reasons. This is my first book that's set in the eastern part of the state. Most of my books have been set Gastonia West, for those of you who are familiar with that part of the state. My first novel, A Land More Kind Than Home, is set up in the mountains around Asheville in a county just north of Asheville, Madison County, North Carolina. My second novel set primarily in Gastonia, which is my hometown. It's where I was raised. It's where I got my start as a reader, going to the public library there on Garrison Boulevard in Gastonia. And my second novel, The Last Ballad, which is based on the true story of a textile mill strike in 1929, is also set in Gastonia. I wrote my first novel, A Land More Kind Than Home, while I was living in Southwest Louisiana, as Dan mentioned, studying in graduate school under Earnest Gains, which is he was the sole reason I went to graduate school at the university in Louisiana. I wrote my first novel down there, desperately homesick for the mountains of North Carolina. I wrote my second novel, This Dark Road to Mercy, while I was living in West Virginia, teaching at a small liberal arts college called Bethany College. That was my first teaching job. And then I wrote my third novel, The Last Ballad, while living back in North Carolina. We moved back to North Carolina in 2013. My wife is from Wilmington. My parents left Gastonia and settled in Oak Island, just south of Wilmington, in 1998. My brother had moved back to Wilmington, and my in-laws are there, and so we moved back there, and I wrote The Last Ballad while living in North Carolina. That was the first novel that I wrote living in North Carolina. And that was wonderful, because that novel required a lot of research. I had to go back and forth to Gastonia, to the mountains of North Carolina, dip down into the South Carolina upstate, where some of the novel's main characters had spent some time in little towns like Innery and Cowpens and Spartanburg. Well, Spartanburg's not a little town. That's where your director here hails from. Spartanburg's a great city, but a textile city as well. But when it came time to write this novel, When Ghosts Come Home, I decided to set it in the eastern part of the state. I did that for a couple of reasons. First, and most obviously, right when we moved back to North Carolina, I was at an event at East Carolina University, And somebody asked me at the library, where are you living? And I said, well, we live in Wilmington. We moved down there because my parents live in Oak Island. And this gentleman said, well, have you ever heard about the plane crash in Oak Island in the late 70s or early 80s? And I said, no, but I would love to hear about that. He said, well, there was this enormous airplane that landed, and rumor was that it was full of drugs, and I can't remember the story, and all these things happened, and the airplane was too big for the runway. It was this small municipal airfield, and they had to hire a stunt pilot to come and fly the airplane away. And as I was like supposed to be doing an event like this, and they were like, it's time for you. And I was like, hold on, tell me more. Tell me more. Speak into this recording device. And this is a microphone. This looks like the ink packet that is going to explode if I go outside the library with this blazer that I haven't paid for. So keep an eye on me. But he told that story about Oak Island, and that kind of stuck in my mind. And I was working on The Last Ballad at that time. And that book took a long time to research. It took a long time to write. And I would send my editor a bunch of words of that novel, and while I was waiting to hear back from him, I would work on a short story about a mysterious aircraft that landed at the airport in Oak Island, North Carolina, down in Brunswick County. Some of y'all might know where that is. If you travel about an hour and a half north of here, you'll bump into it. But also during that time, I began to look around me where we were living in Wilmington, and everything felt strange, like everything felt strange. The weather felt strange to me. The landscape felt strange to me. The geography felt strange to me. The flora and the fauna felt strange to me. Beach culture felt strange to me. These were things that I did not grow up around. These were things that weren't natural to my experience. Gastonia has a whole lot more in common with Asheville and the northern panhandle of West Virginia than it does with Wilmington. And I felt like an outsider. And I looked around me, and I was kind of surrounded by insiders. My wife was raised there. She knows that place. She knows that the movement of life there. She knows the landscape there. She knows the weather there better than I do. And then we had 2 little babies. Our first daughter was born in 2014, and our second was born in 2016. And I began to look around me. I mentioned Ron Rash at the top of our show. And Ron has a line that I think about a lot that he's said a couple of times. He says, landscape is destiny, that the landscape that you are born into will speak to who you become. It either emboldens you, or it defines you, or it limits you. And that's something I think about when I write a lot, when I'm creating characters that are born of a specific landscape. He mentioned Pat Conroy. I'm glad to know that y'all had heard of him. A lot of people haven't in this area. But Pat is certainly a product of landscape. Destiny was certainly, landscape was certainly destiny for Pat. And I feel like it is for me. And it's going to be for my children. They're going to grow up knowing the coast of North Carolina in ways that I will not, because it was not in me. I was not born at New Hanover Regional Medical Center like both of my kids were. And because I'm a parent, which means I'm driven by ego and fear, like the rest of you, I fear there's going to come a point in my life where my understanding of what the world is going to diverge from what my children's understanding of the world is. And maybe that's going to be because we're born at different cultural, historical moments, or maybe it's because they're from the beach and they grew up around boats and they grew up around oyster bakes or roast or whatever they call them, and surfing and boys who drive boats, too fast to show off. And I didn't grow up around those things. And there's going to come a time when our experiences are going to go different ways. And I can't do anything about that. But what I can do as a writer is I can try to immerse myself in a place, in a space, in a culture, in a time, to try to understand something about it as if I were from there, as if I were from that place. And so when I began working seriously on the novel that would become When Ghosts Come Home, I thought, well, I need to understand this place if I'm going to write about it. My parents had moved down to Oak Island in 1998. I spent the summer of 1998 lifeguarding down at Bald Head Island out there. And I got to know that area. This was before Oak Island was discovered. The airport was tiny at the time. There were no franchise businesses. There were no franchise hotels that I can remember. Everything was local. And because I worked at Bald Head Island, which y'all may have seen in movies like Weekend at Bernie's or other things like that, you have to take a ferry to the island. And my lifeguard shift started at 7 o'clock in the morning. And so I would leave my parents' house at 5:30 and make this lonely pre-dawn drive down the center artery of the island, the only artery of the island, Oak Island Drive, take the bridge off the island, go into Southport. I would see the lighthouse in the distance on Caswell Beach, and I would familiarize myself with the neon signs advertising fudge or pancake houses. I mean, y'all know what I'm talking about. Y'all got the same stuff down here that we do there. And I knew it to a certain degree, but I didn't know it the way I would know it if I had gone to public school there, like I did in Gastonia in the 80s. And so I began thinking about my experience of growing up in the 80s, and I thought, when is the time that I first became aware of what was going on around me, right? When I really felt like I'm a citizen of this place now. And the first time I really remember feeling that is right around 1983, 1984. I was 7 years old, and 7 years old. I was born in 1977, which I'm sure y'all are like, wow, I thought he was, 23. But that was the election. That was Ronald Reagan's second election. And I can remember Mondale. I can remember Reagan. I can remember Born in the USA. I can remember Morning in America. I can remember City on a Hill. I can remember Jesse Helms. I can remember hearing the things that my parents talked about. And they were staunch Republicans, staunch conservatives. And that was the first time that I can remember knowing something beyond the confines of childhood. And that's how I came to know my place, my people in Gastonia, North Carolina. And I thought, well, what if I had grown up in eastern North Carolina? What if I had grown up in Brunswick County, North Carolina in 1984? What would that experience have been like, the way that my children are growing up, maybe my daughter's 6 in 2020, who's hearing what her parents are talking about, who is hearing what's happening on our news stations or our radios or whatever the case may be. And so that's why I decided to set it during that time. But another thing that makes this novel a little bit different is that this is a mystery. This is the first real mystery I've written. I've been accused of writing mysteries before. I was a finalist for a mystery award, the Edgar Allan Poe Award, which is given to mystery writers. And I remember being terrified when I found out that I was a finalist. And then I saw the other finalists, Stephen King, Ian Rankin, Karen Slaughter, people who write real mysteries. And we went to the event in New York City, and I was there with my agent, who's this seasoned, grizzled, burn-it-down New York publishing guy. And he's like, I don't know, kid, you stand a chance. And then Stephen King walked in. He goes, Stephen King wouldn't be here if they hadn't already told him he was going to win. You're not going to win, kid. You're not going to win. And I didn't, and that was fine. Stephen King won. And that was totally fine. But my other novels, especially my first two, A Land More Kind Than Home and This Dark Road to Mercy, that have been bandied about as being mysteries, are not traditional mysteries. Because to me, traditional mysteries are super smart and structured and forward-looking, and they have little traps and chutes and triggers and trampolines at all the right moments. And that's not the kind of writer I am. And my first two novels are mysteries in that the characters within the books don't have all of the information, but the reader does. And the mystery is, when are all the characters going to share the information, and how are they going to learn it? When are they going to learn it? And what's going to happen when they all share it? Something bad, probably, is going to happen when all these threads converge and all these threats converge, right? And so whatever suspense I'm able to garner in those books, it's the suspense of you waiting, right? Not the suspense of you and the characters waiting. With When Ghosts Come Home, this is a real mystery. You're waiting, the character's waiting, and to be honest with you, I also was waiting. This novel takes place in the fall of 1984 when a local sheriff, he's 63 years old, is awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of an aircraft passing low over his house. And he knows there is no good reason for an aircraft of that size to be flying that low this late at night, heading for the tiny municipal airport on the mainland just across the waterway. And so our sheriff, his name is Winston Barnes, He's locked in a tough re-election battle against a local opponent who is the son of a wealthy land developer. Our sheriff, his challenger, has money to burn in advertising, and our sheriff does not. He's a good man, he's done the best job he can, and he knows he's probably going to lose. He drives out to the airport in the middle of the night, and he finds two things that change not only his life, but the life of this little community forever. He finds an abandoned DC-3, which is a World War II era cargo plane. He finds it crash landed. It's sitting sideways on the runway. The rear landing gear has snapped off. The plane is abandoned. It is completely empty, and later when they go to process the aircraft, they will not be able to find any fingerprints inside of it. And then off in the grass alongside the runway is the body of a local man who's been shot dead and left behind. This local man is the son of a local civil rights leader who's also a high school history teacher. And so rumors of drug smuggling, insider, outsider, black crime, those things spring up immediately. But the sheriff knows this guy's family. And as we do in the South, when we know somebody's family, we say, I know his family. There's just no way. I know his people. There's just no way. But the sheriff's challenger says, maybe you don't know his family as well as you think you do. And the sheriff's challenger sees an opportunity to drive wedge issues in the campaign. And so the sheriff knows he's sitting on this powder keg, and the election's just a week away. And then the FBI comes in. And this investigation that the sheriff believes he can stake his reputation on begins to slip away from him. Meanwhile, his wife is suffering from cancer, and he knows that if he loses this election, they'll lose the health insurance, and they don't know what they're going to do. And in the midst of all of this, his daughter, who's 25 years old, she returns home surprisingly out of nowhere from Dallas, Texas. She is suffering an incredible loss, and she is struggling in a new marriage. And she comes back home to try to make sense of her life and nurse this tragedy and make sense of her marriage. So relatively early in the novel, Winston has a lot on his hands, and he's got a lot on his mind. And so when I say that I didn't know how this was going to end, that I was waiting just like the characters were waiting, and maybe how you will wait unless you're much smarter than I am and you figure it out sooner than I did, was I created characters that I thought were really interesting. I've got Winston, this middle-aged sheriff who's struggling to do the best he can in really impossible circumstances. I've got his daughter. She's 25 years old. She's a law school graduate. She got pregnant during law school and married the child's father, but she never took the bar exam. And then when the baby is born, it's stillborn. And there's a point in the novel where Colleen thinks, I was going to be a lawyer, and now I'm not. And I was going to be a mother, and now I'm not that either. So what am I? And she goes back home to try to figure it out. There's also a third character, a young man named Jay. He's a young black man from Atlanta who got into some trouble in Atlanta, as young boys sometimes do, and his parents, sensing that he may be hanging out with the wrong crowd, sent him up to Southport, North Carolina, sent him out to the country to live with his perfect older sister, who's 26 years old, her perfect new husband, and their perfect new baby. And Jay has a lot of opinions about being out in the country with people he doesn't understand. Regardless of whether they're black or white, these people don't make any sense to him. And as soon as he arrives, just a few months later, his brother-in-law is found dead on the runway at the local airport. And so these are the principal characters, and these were interesting people to me, and I enjoyed writing about them. But there came a point in the process where my editor said, these are really interesting characters. I'm really enjoying reading about them. What happens in the novel? And I said, I don't know. Can you help me figure that out? Can you get some of those Edgar Award-winning writers and maybe figure out how they did it? And so it was really a process of trying to look through clues for me to figure out who these people are. What are the inside forces coming to bear, coming to put pressure on them? What are the outside forces coming to bear, coming to put pressure on them? How do secrets work in small communities? How do secretive people work in small communities? And what I found was that I had written a mystery. I had written a mystery with some twists and turns. I had written a mystery with some late in the game reveals. And I was thrilled mostly because I felt really, really smart. And that had never happened to me before in my career of writing these novels. And so that's kind of the story of writing a novel. I wrote a lot of it before the pandemic. And I wrote most of it by hand. That was the first time I had done that. You know, people always ask me, what's the hardest thing about publishing a book? And I say, oh, that's easy, writing one. You send letters until you get an agent, and then your agent gets you an editor, and then your editor works with the sales team, and then, you know, Litchfield Books opens the boxes and puts them on the shelf for you. You don't have to do any of that stuff. And writing a book is hard, and it takes a long time, and the process for all of mine have been different. But for this novel, I wanted to know these characters as intimately as possible, and it was always my goal to write a relatively slender, fast-moving book. I really wanted to do that to see if I could do it, to not get bogged down in character and setting and context and exposition and cultural and eras and all of this stuff, because I really get excited about that kind of stuff. Like with my Mill novel, Last Ballad, which was set in 1929, it was so fun writing about music and clothes and industry and politics of the 20s and the Great Depression and migration of poor people moving from mill to mill and mountains to farms and all of these places. That was really fun for me because it meant I didn't have to write. I could just research all the time. But writing a book set in 1984 doesn't take quite as much research because I can remember rotary phones. I can remember my sister having a poster of David Cassidy and Joan Jett. I can remember beanbag chairs and shag carpeting and four-poster beds with canopies over them. You know, I can remember that stuff in my sister's room. And so it wasn't that big of a deal to write about it. And actually, if any of you are a fan of the North Carolina writer Jill McCorkle, the way Colleen's bedroom is described in this book, that is Jill McCorkle's bedroom. The way she described it to me when I asked women who were high school or college students in the 70s and 80s what their rooms looked like. So if you ever want to know about Jill McCorkle, this is your chance. I can't speak to what her contemporary room looks like. I wasn't going to ask that. So this is kind of the process. So I thought I would read a little bit from the novel. And, you know, I get accused of writing dark books a lot. People always say, you know, when you talk, you're kind of funny. And I say, thank you, tell my wife that. For Halloween this year, I dressed as a dad who'd been locked out of the house going for the newspaper. And I wore my robe and pajama pants and slippers and carried the newspaper. And my wife said, nobody's going to think that's funny. And we were on foot, and every car that drove by was like, great costume, Dad! And I was like, yeah! And I had a coffee cup, and I had, I'll be honest with you, had some beers in my robe, and I was drinking, you know, coffee cup beer on the streets, and my wife got a video of me, unbeknownst to me, pouring a can into my coffee cup, and she screamed, I will be using this video evidence in our divorce proceedings. And my only response was, everybody prepares for the morning in different ways. Our neighbor also said, I wish you wore that many clothes when you went out for the newspaper in the morning. That wasn't captured on video, but that may also be used in the proceedings. But I do tend to kind of write dark books, but I do think that all of my books have a certain element of humor in them. I think there are funny turns in a lot of my novels, and I thought that I would read something that I find kind of funny today. But what oftentimes makes something funny is pain, and we oftentimes don't realize that. My brother is a comedian, and my brother's funniest jokes are based on his wife running around on him, his dog dying, and my dad passing away, which luckily for my brother's comedy, all happened at about the same time, right? So he's got a lot of comedy based around that, but there is no victimless comedy. If you think back to funny movies, it's about somebody else's tragedy made funny, right? And so in this novel here, and for those of you who are writers, maybe some of the young people in the room, If you just try to rely on comedy all the time, then your reader is not swinging through emotions. If you just try to rely on drama all the time, then your reader is not swinging through emotions. And that's what life is. Life is constant movement, playing all the scales of our emotional capabilities. That's why heightened drama is called melodrama. And that's why lower comedy is called slapstick, right? So how can we swing the reader through these things and make the comedy as resonant as the drama? And I hope I did that with the selection that I'm going to read today. This is a moment in the novel where Colleen, it's the day after she's arrived home. She has learned that her father is involved in this investigation. She has learned that her high school classmate, Rodney Bellamy, is rumored to be part of it. After all, his body was found out on the runway. She's also learned that Rodney has left behind a young son who would be about the same age that her son would be, had her son lived. And she is back home, and she is glad to be home, but almost immediately she regrets coming home, as many of us do. Sometimes, not all the time. My mom lives, 30 minutes away from me, and I see her quite a bit. But when my older sister and my younger brother and I are all home at the same time, my sister is 16, I am 8, and my brother is 5.5, and we argue as such about much the same stuff that we did then. My brother and I still chew too loud for my sister. It's all still there. And Colleen wakes up the day after coming home feeling that much that way. She and her mother are on the way to the grocery store, to the food line, because they have just learned that the FBI has hired an FBI agent who's also a former pilot who flew the DC-3 in Vietnam to come up to North Carolina and repair this aircraft and fly it up to Wilmington so it can be processed in a covered hangar, because clearly the sheriff's department is not capable of handling this investigation. And so the sheriff's angry that they're sending somebody in, and his wife is not happy that this FBI agent is going to be staying with them, because it is the off season and all the hotels are closed in Oak Island at this time. And so they're on the way to the food line to get groceries. Colleen is not feeling great. She spent too much of the night drinking Old Milwaukee out of her dad's refrigerator and hiding the cans under her bed, much like she did when she was in high school. Some things never change. And so they have gotten into kind of an argument on the way to the grocery store. And when they go into the grocery store, they immediately go their separate ways. When she reached the end of the aisle and turned left to round another, Colleen spotted a woman at the far end pushing a young baby in a stroller. Colleen recognized her immediately. It was Myra Page, a girl she'd been friends with in high school but had hardly seen since they both left home for college. Myra didn't see her, and Colleen stood for a moment watching the baby in the stroller, who looked to be a little boy. He was chewing on something as if his teeth hurt. And Colleen tried to gauge his age, but something in her stomach turned, and she suddenly feared that she was going to vomit right there on the floor. She spun away from Myra toward the meat counter where great slabs of steaks and ground hamburgers sat on crushed ice behind thick glass. She tried to remember the layout of the store, to recall where the restrooms were. She scanned the back wall for a sign, and then she saw it on her left and made a beeline for it. Colleen was barely able to close the stall door and lift the lid of the toilet seat. And then I'll spare you the details. Are some of you like, no, I want to hear about that? She flushed the toilet and grabbed a fistful of toilet paper and dabbed at her face and neck. She opened the stall door and walked to the sink. She ran the water and splashed it over her face, cupped some of it into her mouth, swished and spit it out. Her pale face stared at her from the mirror. She winced at the dark circles under her eyes. Her blonde hair still looked damp where she'd pulled it back in the stubby ponytail. Her pocketbook was in her mother's shopping cart, so she didn't have anything with her. No lip gloss, no brush, nothing to improve what she was seeing before her. She pinched her cheeks to bring color back into them, gave them a few light slaps. She opened her mouth, smiled gruesomely at herself. Outside the bathroom, Colleen saw that Myra Page had reached the end of the aisle and was now standing by the butcher's counter, a woman beside her. To her great horror, Colleen discovered that the woman with Myra was her own mother, and she was holding Myra's baby in her arms, her fingers clasping the teething toy and passing it in and out of the baby's mouth while its flailing arms reached for it. Myra and Colleen's mother were laughing. Both women looked up and saw Colleen at the same time. Her mother smiled a smile that looked like elation to Colleen. Myra simply waved as if she and Colleen were still girlfriends. Myra, as if remembering or intuiting the great upheaval of Colleen's life, cocked her head to the side and looked at Colleen as if she were a child. "And how are you?" she asked, once Colleen was close enough. "Now you're in..." She paused as if trying to remember something. "Texas now, right?" "Yeah," Colleen said. "Dallas. My husband took a job there." "Wow," Myra said. "I bet it's really beautiful out there." "It's nice," Colleen said. She tried to smile, tried to keep her eyes off Myra's baby boy. "It's growing on me." "Well, now she's home visiting her mama," Colleen's mother said, rocking her body and the baby from side to side at the word mama. She laughed a little and then looked at Colleen. Her face changed. "Are you okay?" she asked. Colleen nodded her head and did her best to smile. "Honey, did you just throw up?" Colleen was crying by the time they made it out to the car. Her mother sat in the passenger seat while Colleen lifted the paper bags full of groceries into the trunk. When she was finished, she slammed it closed and left the car sitting where it was. She pulled her shirt sleeves over her hands and wiped her eyes, and then she opened the driver's door and climbed inside. She started the engine and backed out of the space without looking at her mother. "I'm sorry," her mother said. "I don't know what I was thinking." "It's okay," Colleen said. She sniffed, wiped at her eyes again. "I wasn't thinking at all," her mother said. I just saw Myra, and I didn't think a thing about holding her baby. I just forgot." "Forgot what?" Colleen asked. They had come to a stop at a red light before leaving the parking lot and turning onto Beach Road. "Forgot that I was with you? Forgot that I lost my son? Forgot that you lost your grandson?" "I don't know," Colleen, her mother said. Maybe for a minute, I forgot to be sad." Her face broke and she closed her eyes. Colleen knew she was fighting tears. She had rarely seen her mother cry, and seeing it now surprised her. Colleen reached out and closed her hand over her mother's. "It's okay," she said. "I'm not mad. I'm definitely not mad at you. I'm just sad, and I know you are too. It is what it is." The light turned green, and Colleen eased onto the gas and turned out of the parking lot. They rode in silence for a moment. "I shouldn't have held that stupid baby," her mother finally said. Colleen smiled a little, looked over at her. "It did look stupid, didn't it?" Her mother smiled. "Yeah, it did. It looked pretty stupid." Colleen laughed. She reached for the radio. "Stupid baby," she said. I would love to take any questions. Thank you. I'd love to take any questions y'all might have about writing this book or writing my other books, or what it was like being on the set with Ryan Gosling when we filmed The Notebook. Yes?
I often wonder how you come up with characters' names.
That's a great question. And your name, I'm kidding. How do I come up with characters' names? Lots of different ways. Maybe they're modeled on somebody who has a trait that Colleen has in my book. Maybe it's modeled on someone that I met who reminded me of one of my sister's older friends. And I said, ooh, that person's name's Colleen. I'm gonna think about my sister's friend who wasn't named Colleen, but maybe this person reminds me of her. Lots of different ways. With my first novel tells the story of a young boy who's smothered during a healing service at a little church in the mountains of North Carolina. And he's got a younger brother named Jess who witnesses this tragedy and knows things about the event that he's afraid of sharing with his parents. He kind of protects his parents. And one of my favorite novels is a novel by a North Carolina writer named Fred Chappell called I'm One of You Forever. The main character in that novel is named Jess, and he's a little boy who kind of protects his parents. And so that was kind of an homage to Jess Kirkman from Fred's novel. Jess Hall from my novel is an homage to him. But characters come from all kinds of places. The villain in my first novel is named Carson Chambliss, and that sounds like a villain's name to me. All those S's. And it involves snake handling as well. And so Carson Chambliss. And that's kind of called a character nym, which is something character NYM. That's something that you might have seen in late 19th century literature by someone like Mark Twain or William Dean Howells or Charles Chestnut or Kate Chopin, where, mostly local color writers, where you name a character in a way that portrays something about their characterization. And I think I do that sometimes too. But I always try to create characters that feel like their names that feel noble, names that feel threatening. So yeah, but names come from all kinds of places. Sometimes they're homage names, When I wrote my second novel, This Dark Road to Mercy, I have two sisters named Easter and Ruby. And I just loved those names. They just felt so innocent and so childlike and so young. And those girls really burrowed, into my heart. And so those were sweet names to play with. But then even those girls, they create their own names because they name themselves. Their mother passes away, and they rename themselves things that their mother loved. And so one girl names herself Purple Journey because her mother loved the color purple in the band Journey. And the other one names herself Boston. Oh, I can't remember what her name is, but they name themselves after things their mother loved. And so names are important to me. When we named our own children, those names were important to us. Trying to capture who they felt like to us when their existence came into our mind. Not so much who we wanted them to be. We didn't name them, Zora Neale Hurston or Sandra Day O'Connor or anything like that. But who we wanted them to feel like. But names are important. But names are tricky too. Names are very tricky, and sometimes characters' names change. Yes. Yes, ma'am. You start up, and then there's somebody right behind you. Go ahead.
I love themes of mercy, forgiveness, sacrifice, and you just mentioned that book about mercy. I wondered if it came out of your story and your soul as you were doing your PhD. Were you struggling as you were studying and writing your thesis?
Sure, that's a great question, yeah.
And that's why you wrote that book about mercy. I wanted to ask a question about if you could tell me a little bit about that book.
Sure, yeah. So my novel, This Dark Road to Mercy, is my second book. That one I started writing that one probably in 2010. So I was 2 years out of my PhD, but it came after the struggle of writing my first book, which, believe me, I needed some mercy after working on that one for as long as I did. But This Dark Road to Mercy tells the story of a washed-up minor league baseball player who kidnaps his two daughters from a foster home and tries to go on the run. He's given up his parental rights, and he kidnaps them. He's got some bad people looking for them and looking for him. And he tries to take them on the road and be a father to them, even though his oldest especially, whose name is Easter, she knows it's too late. She believes her dad is a washed-up loser. But does she believe that because that's what she's always been told, or does she believe that because it's true? And she finds some places in the novel to give her father a little bit of mercy. And I think that he tries to create space in the novel to give it to himself as well. And that is set in the summer of 1998 in North Carolina, and it's got a little bit in Charleston, it's got a little bit in St. Louis, Missouri. But it's set against the backdrop of the home run race between Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, which was the last time that Americans liked each other, for a good reason. You know, we liked each other after 9/11, but it took tragedy for us to like each other. But in 1998, it doesn't matter if you were what side of whatever divide you were on, baseball fan or not, we were all aware that was going on, and we were rooting for these two guys to be heroes. And it was exciting, and we were all excited about the same thing. You know, there was nobody in America saying, "Oh, that home run race, I hate that thing." You know, fake news or whatever. We were all excited about it. And then, of course, we suspected, maybe, we learned later that these guys are, you know, using performance-enhancing drugs and all of these things. And we think, oh, man, we were tricked. But it was great. We loved it while it was happening. And so, you know, the state motto of North Carolina is to be rather than to seem. And that's something I'm very interested in. The things that are and the things that seem to be. And so, you know, these guys seemed like American heroes, but they weren't quite. And Wade seems like a total washed-up loser, but maybe he's just down on his luck and things can change. And so I was thinking about forgiveness. I was thinking about parents and children. I was thinking about the way that our parents disappoint us and the ways in which we disappoint them and the ways in which we go on to disappoint our own children, and how maybe there's a little bit of mercy for all of us in one way or another. And so that's where mercy came from in that book. So thank you. There's a young person. I don't have my glasses on. I apologize.
Oh, hi. So you're often compared to Harper Lee in your review.
Never heard of her.
And in a synopsis of the New York Times, it's written that as Cormac McCarthy decided to rewrite Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, do you relate to that review? Do you draw from those authors and those books, specifically if you're in A Land More Kind Than Home?
Sure, definitely in A Land More Kind Than Home, sure. You know, we have such a weight of history on us in the South for historical reasons, cultural reasons, political reasons, geographic reasons, regional reasons, and also literary reasons. When you pick up a pen and say, I'm going to be a writer from the South, William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Zora Neale Hurston, Pat Conroy now, they say, are you sure? Are you sure? You going to do it? I might have something to say about it. We'll see, right? And there's a phenomenon called the anxiety of influence, which is an idea that you are always writing under someone's influence, and you are either writing against it or you are writing with it, right? That's by a literary critic named Harold Bloom. There's also a literary cultural critic named Henry Louis Gates. Some of y'all might know him from his PBS show about genealogy, which is fascinating. But he has a term that's more commonly used in discussions of African American literature, which is called signifying, where you take something that exists and you amend it or you extend it to mean something else, right? So like Charles Chestnut was a black writer from North Carolina, born in 1858 and died in 1932, and he looked at the Uncle Remus plantation tales, these quaint, sweet tales of an old former slave entertaining a young white child with like talking animals and all this stuff. So Charles Chestnut looked at that and said, well, if people love that, I'm going to give them plantation tales, but I'm going to amend them and extend them, and I'm going to show the horrors of slavery in these tales. I'm going to give them what they want and then slip in what I think they need, right? And so the anxiety of influence, signifying, Southern writers are always writing with, against, amending, extending. So when I hear or read that I'm compared to Harper Lee, I think a couple of things. My first thought is always one of being honest with myself and one of being humbled. in that reviewers take the unknown and compare it to the known, right? Like it tastes like chicken. It doesn't really, but you got to say it tastes like something, right? So this Southern writer writes like Harper Lee. That's somebody that 99% of readers know or will know by a certain age. So what that means is this person is Southern, this person writes about coming of age, this person writes about children struggling with difficult issues that adults are levying upon them, right? So my humble part of me says, well, they got to make a comparison to somebody. But at the same time, the rational part of me says, well, yeah, I read To Kill a Mockingbird, and I saw how wonderful it can be on the page to portray children struggling with how adults make messes of things. And how children intuit things that they can't quite explain or verbalize, right? They struggle with issues that their parents visit upon them. And they say, well, that's not right. Why are they doing that? And you know, there's a part in the novel, you know, of course Scout has questions about decisions that are going on in her community. And then if we go Set a Watchman, we learn how deep those questions go, right? Which is the follow-up to Kill a Mockingbird, and disappointed a lot of people. But it was the more realistic book at the same time. There's a part in A Land More Kind Than Home where Jess's mother believes that her son has been healed, that this nonverbal child has suddenly been healed into speaking. And Jess knows that's not the case. And he asks, do you have to believe a miracle any less when you know it's not true? Right? But he doesn't tell his mom because he doesn't want to disappoint her. He protects her. And that protection causes incredible pain later on in the book. And so that kind of stuff is really appealing to me. It also places you as part of a line of descent. You're like, okay, you know, I'm part of this now. You know, somebody has deemed me part of this. And that's a wonderful thing. You know, it's a great thing. I love being from the South. I love being a Southern writer. I'm really proud of it. And I'm perfectly comfortable taking on the mantle of the burden of the South and the burden of being, you know, in the wake of Harper Lee and these other great writers. Thank you. That's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
I really have two questions. One, can you define the Southern Gothic? And the other is, what was it like working with Earnest Gains or being taught by him?
I'll take the Earnest Gains question first. Earnest Gains changed my life. He was a writer. You know, when I was coming of age, I went to school at UNC Asheville, where I now teach. I'm very, very fortunate and very happy to be doing that. But I went to school at UNC Asheville because they had a degree in creative writing, and I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I went to UNCA not knowing what I wanted to write about, but knowing I liked telling stories. I had grew up in a storytelling tradition. I had grew up as an active reader. But I was writing stories based on what I was reading. So if I read a short story by Anton Chekhov, I wrote a story about Russian peasants. If I read a story by Flannery O'Connor, I wrote a story about Catholics in Georgia. I didn't know any Catholic people in Gastonia, you know. And when I read Earnest Gains, his collection Bloodline, which is a collection of like 5 novellas, 5 long short stories, for the first time, I read someone who talked about old people the way my family talked about old people, who talked about land and landscape and rural life the way that my parents and my grandparents talked about land and landscape and rural life, because I come from farmers and mill workers. And although he was a black writer living in Southwest Louisiana who'd been born in 1933 on a plantation, the way he talked about these things was so similar to the way that I grew up hearing about these things. And also the clarity and the muscular style of his realistic writing. And I thought, that's what I want to do. That's exactly what I want to do. And keep in mind, this is 1996. I hadn't read anything by Ron Rash. I hadn't read Cold Mountain. I hadn't read anything by Lee Smith. I hadn't read anything by Clyde Edgerton. But I'd read Earnest Gains. And so from early on, he was my North Star of what I wanted to become as a writer. And so getting to study under him was incredible. I took his final workshop before he retired. It was the fall of 2003. Took the final workshop. And then we just kind of really hit it off. And he would invite me and a couple of other students up to his house. He was born and raised on a plantation where his family had been slaves and sharecroppers. He went back and bought a huge piece of land beside the still standing master's house. He bought the old slave cemetery in the backyard where he and his wife are going to be buried. He passed away a couple of years ago. And every year, the Saturday after Halloween, they would have an All Saints Day cemetery cleanup. So I would always go up for that. We would, cut back brush and whitewash the graves, and they would have food and gumbo and all this, traditional Louisiana food. And we just always stayed in touch and always kind of kept in contact. I still speak with his wife every couple of months just to kind of check in and see how things are going. But he really impressed upon me the importance of understanding that where you're from is worth literature. It doesn't matter if you're the child of sharecroppers and the descendant of slaves, or if you're the child of tenant farmers and mill workers. Where you are from, whatever little dusty corner of the universe you are from, is as worth literature as the billions of New York City novels that are published every year, right? And so that was really, really foundational for me. And when I went down to Louisiana, I was so desperately homesick for North Carolina, and I was also studying under a writer who had left Louisiana at 15 and moved to San Francisco because there were no junior high schools for black kids in Louisiana where he lived. He couldn't go to school anymore. And he wanted to keep going to school, so his mother and stepfather had moved out to Vallejo, California, and they brought him out. And for the first time, he could go to a public library. He could go to school. He could go to the YMCA. He couldn't do any of that stuff in Louisiana. And we think those things were a long time ago, and those people are still alive. Like Ruby Bridges is like 65 years old, And so we think all that stuff is behind us, but that stuff still lives in more ways than one. And he said, the first time I could go to a library, I thought, I'm going to go to this library. I'm going to read every book they've got by and about black people living in Southwest Louisiana. And he went, and those books didn't exist. They weren't in that library. And so he began writing them. He began writing as a way to kind of reclaim the place that he'd left behind. And so hearing him tell these stories, I thought, well, maybe I'll give that a try. Maybe I'll give that a try. And that was foundational to everything that I've done since then. And he was a sweet, sweet person, very humble. He never forgot the people of Southwest Louisiana. His funeral, Cicely Tyson came and spoke at his funeral. But so did the Baptist preacher from New Roads, Louisiana, He was amazing. He was foundational to me. He was incredible to me. And your other question, what is the Southern Gothic? The Southern Gothic, now has become to mean kind of the unknown, threatening South, right? Much of that is based in, some of it's based in stereotype. We think of Deliverance, when we think of Southern Gothic novels, we think of the things that we can't understand or explain: hyperviolence, addiction, poverty. But the idea of the Gothic historically comes from the inexplicable, the things that cannot be explained. If we think about, even European Gothic, Dracula or British Gothic, like Frankenstein or things like that. How do we explain the mystery of creation? Well, let's talk about creating monsters, sewing monsters from human flesh and then animating them, and what happens to the soul, and does the monster have a soul? And so when people come to when white settlers come to the United States, what will become the United States, they settle in places like, New England, and they clear land and they build towns, but these towns are surrounded by forests. And you don't want people to go into the forest, because if they move into the forest, then they fall outside of the control of the town. And obviously the central control is back in the UK under the Crown, but when you go outside the town, then you're weakening the town, right? Because it's like the founding of Jamestown in 1607. John Smith said, "Those who do not work do not eat." So you can't go off by yourself. You got to stay here in the town. And so great stories spring up about what's out there in the woods. Devils, Satan, wild Native Americans, ghosts, monsters, dragons. So if you look at early maps, you can see these monsters drawn in the undiscovered portions of the wilderness. And the farther people came south, and we got to keep in mind that the Spanish were in the South. They were in Florida, they were in Texas, they were in Louisiana, they were all over the place. But this is the British kind of recast of history. The farther south people go, the greater the threat becomes because it's more wilderness. It's more wilderness in the South. And so the South has always been and remains the great unknown territory. It remains that today. Think about a show like Swamp People. You know, how many people do you think live in that swamp, make a living clubbing alligators? 15, 20, maybe? Maybe? But they got their own TV show, right? And then if you live in Boston and you think of Louisiana and the Atchafalaya Basin, which is where some of like the best nature writers and photographers and artists and musicians, Grammy Award winners live, you think of Swamp People, right? That still happens, and that's the Gothic South. That's the Gothic South in play. Maybe one more, yes, sir. And then the student in the back.
You brought something up that's really important, I think, in a lot of ways. Visual media is allowed to do stuff just because of its ability for visual, while with the oral tradition and the writing tradition, you have to describe everything. Mm-hmm. I was thinking, well, regardless of where you're from, how difficult is it to try to describe, gender, racial background, other types of backgrounds without specifically identifying?
That's a great question. You must read a lot. That's a great question. He asked, how do you, in effect, describe characters and characterization without just really knuckling down on it? And so here's an exercise that I often give students. I say, let's create a character. Let's say, we'll say man or woman, what are we doing? Man or woman? And they'll be like, let's do a woman. So I'll write female on the board. And I'll say, how old is this person? They'll say, she's 39. I'll write 39. And I'll say, what's their racial ethnic background? Let's say that she's from, she's a black woman from the American South. I'll write black woman, American South. Okay, what's the era? They're like, it's 1963. Okay, 1963. What's her educational background? Let's say she's in college. Okay, she's a college graduate. Where is she from? Let's say she's from Massachusetts and she's down in the South. And so I'll ask all this stuff and then I'll say, okay, prove it. Let's write a scene without saying, a 39-year-old black woman from Boston comes into Mississippi. The year is 1963. Here's what she believes. Here's how much money her parents make. Here's the kind of neighborhood. Let's prove it. Let's figure out how to do that. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll create a bedroom, we'll create an automobile, and we'll say, okay, look in the windows of this woman's car. First of all, what kind of car is that? Let's look at who we know her to be based on all of these things that she would probably use to describe herself. What kind of bumper stickers are going to be on that car? Let's look in the back seat. Are there books in the back seat? What are they? Is it the Bible or is it the autobiography of Malcolm X? Does she have a map? Is there something circled on the map? Maybe that's where she's going, right? And so we'll look at these different things. Maybe she's got her driver's license already out because she's from Boston and she's driving through Mississippi. And that tells us how she feels about it, but it also shows us, let's look a little closer if you have good eyes. Okay, she's a young black woman, here's how old she is. So there's all these little things that you try to do. Maybe the car is still running and the radio's on and the Beatles are playing. And the DJ says, here's some new music by the boys from Liverpool. And you're like, well, it's obviously not the 1980s or 70s, right? And so there's these little tricks that you want to use to reveal and not talk at the reader and just burden them with information. There's a difference between information and context. Context, when we walk into situations, we're reading the room, right? Like my brother's a stand-up comedian and he'll go into certain rooms and he's like, I'm not gonna tell that joke, right? That Viagra joke's not gonna work with this audience, So you read the room and you read the signs of the room. We do that every day. But if I was walking into the room and somebody was in my ear buzzing all the stuff that I should know, I would be so scrambled in my brain that I wouldn't have the chance to read the room, right? And so it's the fine, and that's just years of practice and just trying and trying and trying and trying. But that's a great question. We had a question from a young person in the back. This might be the last one.
Approximately how long does it typically take for you to write a novel?
Ooh, gosh. Did my wife tell you to ask that question? When I was working on my novel, The Last Ballad, my wife Mallory said, you know, while I was writing that book, she grew, gave birth to, and fed 2 humans from her body. And I was working on my cute little book. She's like, oh, you're still doing that? Aw, good for you. That's good, great that you're still doing that. It depends. You know, when he was talking at the beginning, you know, I've written 4 novels, which is a lot. I'm really proud of that. The first one came out in 2012, the second one in 2014, the third one in 2017, and the fourth one in 2021. So they're slowly getting farther apart. It's not that they necessarily take me that long to write them. It's that my writing life, because I'm not John Grisham or Nicholas Sparks or J.K. Rowling or, you know, any number of other successful writers who pass the test of all of us knowing who they are. I do a lot of things aside from writing. I teach, I travel, I teach workshops. I did a workshop about how to get a literary agent last night over Zoom for 2 hours. And then I came home and prepared for my classes next week that I'm teaching at UNCA. And so I do a lot of things aside from write. And so it takes me a little bit longer. And so all that to say this, I talked about handwriting when ghosts come home, and I did, and that let me slow down a lot in terms of my process. Because I can type. I don't type correctly, but I can type quickly, and I can type faster than I can think. And when I do that, my eyes look at the cursor blinking as if it's waiting for something, right? And you like maybe shop with somebody and they take forever, and you just find yourself standing there and you don't even want to shop anymore, right? Maybe that doesn't happen to everybody, but it does to me. And you think like, why am I here? You don't want to feel that way when you're working on a book. So I handwrite, and I can think faster than I can handwrite. And so my hand's always trying to catch up to my mind, and that is a good place to be. That's like going shopping and thinking, how am I ever going to see all this awesome stuff? What time's the mall close, right? That's a good feeling to have when you have a free Saturday, right? And so it takes me a little bit longer, but you know, I really worked on when Ghosts Come Home when the pandemic hit. My schedule was completely cleared. Events like this were not happening. Teaching was not, things just changed. And it was hard financially, but it also gave me time to finish a book. And so I wrote the bulk of the final drafts during the pandemic. So it takes me, if I really knuckle down, maybe 2 years to feel like I've got a book that's ready for my editor to see it completely, start to finish. So about 2 years probably. Now there are writers that can write a book a year. Sometimes John Grisham writes 2 books a year. You know, he gets up he's sitting at the desk by 7 in the morning and he stops at noon. He starts January 1st every year. You know, that doesn't work for me because I'm hungover. No, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. I shouldn't say that in front of the high school students. Hungover on Jesus. Just up all night. Let this be a good year financially. No, I'm kidding. But you know, at 7 a.m., I'm waking my kids up and making breakfast and packing their lunch so my wife can do what she has to do because I'm gone so much. So when I'm home, I'm like, I'll do breakfast. And she's like, yeah, I know, you will. You will. You'll take him to school too, right? And then so my day starts at 8:30 at my desk. But in the summertime when my kids aren't in school, my day starts at 6:30 at my desk because I don't have to wait for anybody, right? So it just, life is the busyness of life makes it all. It's more challenging than you would expect. I think we're probably on time. Y'all been a fantastic audience. Thank you so much for the great questions and.
Thank you, Wiley Cash, and thank all y'all for being here and supporting, and books in the back from Litchfield Books, please head back. Wiley will head back there and sign your books for you. All right.